A fight is brewing between Ottawa and BC Premier David Eby. It was kicked off on Monday when the Prime Minister announced $750 million to help Quebec deal with asylum seekers. And that got this response from Eby at a meeting of Western premiers.
$750 million for Quebec to deal with immigration pressures from the federal government. They've offered us nothing, $0. I cannot understand how that could happen. I cannot understand why we cannot get a per capita share at a minimum.
Immigration Minister Mark Miller responded in Ottawa, saying Eby was confused and equating asylum seekers with temporary residents. Eby's office fired back with this statement. It's disingenuous to say this is about asylum seekers. Last year, the number of asylum seekers arriving in BC doubled, and we're on track to almost double again this year. I think people in the West are used to the special treatment for Quebec and Ontario, but eventually it gets to be too much. That drew this reply from Minister Miller today.
Let's not confuse apples and oranges. This announcement in Quebec was about compensation for asylum seekers over 2 fiscal years. Per capita is fine, but they also have to be taking their per capita share of the asylum seekers that are coming in.
So where will this fight over how federal resources are shared across provinces go? We're going to talk about that with the Power Panel. Jordan Leichnitz, Tim Powers, Sherelle Evelyn, and Jonathan Kalis. Jonathan, you're in Quebec, and I know this has been an issue for Premier Legault for quite some time. But David Eby isn't just upset about immigration money. He started talking about industrial policy and big investments into electric vehicles and electric batteries in central Canada and not out west. I mean, where's this discontent going to go, do you think?
I'm sort of confused too. Like if Premier Eby is upset about investments on electric vehicles or battery plants in the 2 biggest provinces and not in BC, so you should have a conversation with it. I don't know whether it should be with Minister Miller. You should have a meeting with Minister Champagne and let's have a discussion about that. But you know, it's sort of like he realized he actually misspoke and then went off at a different tangent. But I mean, at the end of the day, talking about proportions and his, getting BC's fair share. Well, BC last year got under 2% of asylum seekers, and Quebec was getting 65% of them. So, there's a reason why this has been an ongoing problem going back 6, 7, 8 years. Mm-hmm. I was at the table back in the day. Those were difficult discussions with Quebec. They were the previous Liberal government in Quebec that continued with Premier Legault and the CAQ. There are challenges that Quebec has had that no one else has had in terms of just the sheer numbers of people coming in. This isn't a Quebec. Yes, French is a factor in all of this, but ultimately it's this mass of people that are coming in that the province wasn't prepared to be able to absorb in a short amount of time. That requires massive resources. Right. The border is controlled by the federal government. Immigration is a federal power principally, and so Quebec, I think reasonably, was asking, you got to help us out here, and that's what was going on here. It has nothing to do with an east-west, center of Canada versus this, the coasts or the west being ignored. I just think that he impulsively spoke about this because it maybe he didn't look into it, and $750 million a lot of money, but he really didn't know what he was talking about. And now he's sort of backtracking. Well,
yeah, it's about 7,500 asylum seekers in British Columbia, 75,000 in Quebec. So the math does favor Quebec, Sherelle, but I also wonder if it's other math that's coming into play.
You think?
And that could be electoral math. Because, we're used to Scott Moe and Blaine Higgs picking a fight with the Prime Minister. They got elections this year, so does David Eby. I mean, what's your sense of this one?
Yeah, I guess as the non-resident British Columbian, there is a lot of kind of pent up, angst about the fact that the West often feels, in the actual West, when I say the West, often feels like it's getting left out, and and you look over east and you see Ontario, you see Quebec, that these are for any party that wants to form government, those are the seats that matter. Elections are called before the polls close in British Columbia on election nights typically. So kind of at the back of your head, you want to say, this is happening because they care more about what's happening in Quebec. They care more about what's happening in Ontario. I don't know if that's a really solid base for this specific argument.
Right.
But it speaks to
Roxham Road was Roxham Road.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And it's a little harder, there's fewer asylum seekers coming across the ocean into Vancouver. That's just a fact. I mean, yes, they can come up through the United States the same way. But it's now when people get into the country and they start moving across the country or settling in various parts of the country, again, you see people kind of staying where they arrived, and that ends up being the big cities in Ontario and Quebec. So again, there are reasons and resources that are needed for these areas. But that isn't to say that there aren't regional issues that do crop up that maybe could be looked at to say, okay, well, let's open up a conversation about X and Y, but on this specific one, I don't know if Eby has a...
So Tim, it's interesting. Cheryl, being from British Columbia, calls this the East. Us being from the East, call this Central Canada. But it is interesting to hear Eby complaining about the electric vehicle industrial policy, because I heard a bit of that in St. John's last week. That there's a frustration that you're an oil economy, not that BC is, but your resource sector, the West, worried about carbon pricing and the impact on the economy while seeing all this money going in. There is something low grade there on federal, provincial, in terms of what's seen as favoritism for Ontario.
Yeah, cultural and historical. When you're a coastal province, of which there are I'll do the math now, Newfoundland, British Columbia,
Everybody's
Nova
coastal
Scotia,
somewhere pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, with Atlantic Canada and British Columbia, you are constantly feeling like you're not a priority to Ottawa. And it's a good theme to hit if you're David Eby and you're about to go back to re-election. They're all seeking asylum. All of the premiers on most issues, they're taking the checks, but they're seeking asylum from the Prime Minister and his polling numbers. Nobody wants to be seen as being too close. We see that at home in Newfoundland with our own Premier, Dr. Furia. Eby, arguably, and the federal or the provincial and the Democrats, can be seen to be more aligned with Justin Trudeau.
They've worked with him on a lot of stuff.
And they've worked with him on a lot of issues. So now is a good time to demarcate on all of that. And you know what? It probably will help him a little bit there right now, particularly if he's going this year. There is a ton of empirical political data now to show that too close of an alignment to the federal Liberals is not a good thing at the moment. That may change over time. But for Eby, yes, some of this, I'm sure, is about the policy issues, as has been discussed, but more of it is the politics.
Jordan, how do you see it as the new Democrat in this conversation?
Yeah, well, I don't think Premier Eby misspoke at all. I think what you saw was real frustration, not just with the issue of Quebec getting the resettlement money, but also with what Premier Eby sees as an imbalance in terms of the investments and the scale and the investments that are not necessarily going to British Columbia. And look, I mean, Tim's right, of course. An election year makes a big difference. That's a very popular fight to be having with a very unpopular Prime Minister. But on the federal Liberal side as well, sometimes these decisions are not devoid of politics either. Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that the issue of Roxham Road in Quebec was an enormous political irritant for the federal Liberals. And their numbers in Quebec are eroding. It was the last bastion of support that they had in the country, and it's really not holding for them. And so it's perhaps not accidental that some of these problems are now getting smoothed out with large amounts of money. And so I think that the idea that Western premiers would look askance at that and be arguing more on a per capita basis, that's not super surprising. And, you can also look, there's other examples, of course. You think about the home heating carve-out that impacted Atlantic Canada, and, you had a federal Liberal minister specifically naming that there was a bit of a partisan undertone to that. It does leave this government vulnerable, I think, sometimes to allegations that kind of spending and that kind of policy making is not even-handed and actually is done with a bit of an electoral eye.
Jonathan, there weren't a lot of premiers left at the First Minister's table that you could kind of look at and say, that's probably someone who can be an ally to Justin Trudeau. David Eby was one of them, right? And I don't know if him and Andrew Furey spoke when they went to D-Day, and smoothed things over. But where does this leave the Prime Minister in terms of provincial allies?
It's probably not the best place to be, and that's why you haven't seen tons of First Ministers meetings. It's probably not the most fun environment. But I mean, he's at the G7 tonight, so I don't know what kind of environment that is, if that's much better. Ultimately, it's a matter of timing, and the politics of this is, so Eby's going up next for an election, so he wants to pick a fight. Justin Trudeau is going to pick and choose where he wants to have fights, who's popular at which time. And, yes, he's had a pretty stable relationship with Eby and the previous government as well. So, it's all a matter of timing. In terms of Quebec, though, like when I say that Eby misspoke, he just in the sense that he chose something so outrageously, well, incorrect. And does settling a score with Quebec right here and now, where there's no election in the next 12 months in either province, it may actually be because it's good policy and good politics. Again, those are so rare these days when you have the good policy and good politics that you're actually surprised and you're caught deadpan. You're not sure. There must be something else to it. This has been worked on for months and months. So I think you're going to see more of these as we have other provincial elections coming up this year. We certainly know New Brunswick, that's been, fodder for both sides, by the way. They continue to hammer on each other. I don't think you're going to see Scott Moe, he's picked a fight with Justin Trudeau, but Justin Trudeau hasn't really cared too much because what's he have to gain other than to look strong when they said they weren't going to respect the law on the carbon tax?
Well, before I let Sherelle have the last word here, I just have to throw another possible provincial election into the mix. Story from my colleague Jean Laroche in Nova Scotia. Tim Houston, no longer wedded to fixed election date his government set in 2021. He says the election will be when the election will be. So Sherelle, we might have yet another.
Ontario, Doug Ford.
Well, yeah, Doug Ford has fixed the beer store issue,
Labrador.
apparently. So,
Start your engines.
So there you go. We could have like 9 provincial elections, Sherelle, and we still haven't got foreign interference sorted out because, but anyway, quick last word on David Eby.
Well, I think there's lots of fights that David Eby could pick. I mean, there's the softwood lumber issue, there's the mills closing all over the place, housing, how the decriminalization programs are going. All of these things that if the David Eby's looking for help and allyship and and resources from the federal government, I think there's better arguments than this specific one on asylum seekers.
Okay, we're going to let that be the last word, but thank you all. It's good to see you on this Wednesday. Jonathan Kalis, Sherelle Evelyn, Jordan Likens, Tim Powers.
Thank you, Captain Kirk. Nice to be on the Enterprise.
more of a Picard.